The material that you're about to listen to and engage with came from our 2017 Missiology Lectures, when myself, along with my colleague Johnny Ramirez-Johnson, said we need to do this next 2017 Missiology Lectures on this topic of race, theology, and mission. And we invited Dr. Love Seacrest to engage with us in that process. We wanted to explore the challenging questions regarding racism and ethnocentrism and xenophobia and all of those issues from the perspective of world Christianity with regard to how these realities have existed in many parts of the world, and also as part of the colonial mission endeavors.
It is fascinating to think that the realities we were talking about are not the experiences of one individual or even one society. We're talking about whiteness as a way of defining the world. And the conference and the conference presenters address time and again this epistemology, this way of making meaning. It has also been described as colonization and post-colonization. The question is not about guilt, it's about engagement. It's about what are we going to do with what we have inherited. So the fact that we're having the conversation should not point a finger at you as a listener or viewer.
But these are hard conversations. The conversation about race is one that has been deferred for so long and so often, over and over again. As soon as we get close to having a meaningful conversation about race, we recoil from the pain of it. And so in our lectures, you'll see some of that pain emerge. You'll see some people who have long experienced racism express and declare and name experiences that they have had that have been deeply formative, deformative even. So this conversation is not a pretty one, but we're having it.
As observers, as listeners, you will be engaging, and we invite you to invite the Holy Spirit. The three of us pray a lot about this series. We humbly submitted to God and pleaded for God's mercy to lead us. We are feeble, and combined, we are imperfect, and we have prayed that the Lord will fill the gaps. And the conversation is only a starter. It is in your hands. It is in your community. It is in your family. And most importantly, it is on your knees. Why don't we begin, Dr. Jennings, you responding to Mark however you think appropriate, and then we continue the conversation.
Well, I want to thank Mark for those fabulous comments and the vulnerability he showed as president of the most important, the most important seminary in the world.
Amen.
It's It's a rare thing to have a seminary president speak about whiteness in the way he did. So I very much appreciate that, Mark. And I hope all faculty, staff, and students present will recognize that. It is difficult because for so many people, I used to, and Dr. Seacrest knows this from many years ago, for so many people, these things have been so woven together, their Christianity, their Christian identity, and their whiteness. And I would sometimes write the word white on the board, and I would touch the board, and I would say to the students, I'm not touching you, I'm touching the word white. But there'd actually be some students who they would flinch when I did that because it's so identified with that word. And we understand that identification, we must remember that identification was hard won. Becoming white in America was an achievement. To strip, if I would have had time, I would have talked about the stripping away of immigrant identity and the taking on of whiteness. That's how people survived. And we forget that to our peril. For so many people, to be an immigrant is to be a stranger, and you don't want to stay in the space of the stranger. So as quickly as you can, remove yourself from the pain of being the stranger, you will do that. So whiteness is not just an act of hubris. To step on the path is a step on the path for survival for so many people.
Thank you very much. There are several questions that can be tied together, but there's one that I want to prioritize. How does gender interact with your definition of whiteness?
Yes. The move toward maturity is the move toward being a mature man. There's no doubt about that. It is to be able. I'm working on a small book for theological. The fundamental problem we face within, we didn't talk about education because couldn't fit that in with giving it everything else going on. But one of the fundamental problem we face is that most higher education in America is shaped inside one trajectory: the formation of us all into self-sufficient men. And so masculinity stands at the end of the accomplishment of maturity. To be able to stand self-sufficiently, independently, knowing your own voice. We give other kinds of clothing to this, but in truth, it's a beautiful masculinity that's very seductive. And just like anyone can be white, anybody can be a man. It's not just men who can be men. And not just white men who are pressed into a persona, because it is a persona. It's not, it's not the actuality of it. It can be, but it's a persona. But anybody can step inside that persona. And the tragedy is for so many people, they don't know it's a persona. They think it's what God created. Mm.
And how will femininity interact as maleness that you have described?
Well, let's be a little careful. Masculinity and femininity, we don't want to, let's just make it simple. We don't want to harden them into things. What we want to recognize is that calling into question masculinity is calling into question various ways in which it has been narrated and shaped for people to enter. Just like femininity, we want to call into question, as I like to say, we want to call into question all the storytellers in the world that want to tell us through story what it means to be human, and who then demand the gospel to fit into their story of what it means to be human, what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman. I grew up in the Northeast, in the Midwest, in Michigan. I live in the Northeast now, excuse me, it was Freudian slip there. But like many kids, I had football coaches and all those coaches in high school. And, my coaches were hideous people. Not because they meant to be hideous, but because they had a very clear idea of what a man was. And all the little boys who didn't fit into that, the pain and the horror of not fitting, and the men who felt so proud that they fit, but in the moment of fitting, they lost all sense of who they were. They just never knew it. So thank God for those men and for those women who have pushed back against the confines of gender identity and who say day after day, I am not that, and I'm not going to be that. It's too bad that too many Christians are uncomfortable with people who push back like that.
Would you like to comment before we move to the next?
I think that narrative storytelling is one way of explaining why Christian movies are so bad. What I mean by that really is simply that there is a kind of stereotyping and type scripting that feels so preset. And part of the reason it rings often, has tragically, painfully rung so often shallowly, is that it is not an account of a vital humanity. How can we represent an incarnational God and not do a better job understanding what it means to be human?
Yeah.
So that is our crisis. That's part of the human crisis. But it's, and given that it's a complex task for anyone, I think the kinds of things that you're describing are a piece of that.
Now, Dr. Jennings, you entice us to move into a new space.
Yes.
And to create new communities.
Yes.
Over half the questions are one way or another of asking the how to.
But
let me put the question in this manner.
Mm-hmm.
Would you care to describe a first-person knowledge of any one of these communities and how did it came about and how have you experienced it?
Well, there are communities all over the country, all over the world where this is happening. Some are the more celebrated, intentional communities, but I'm also thinking about the little small places where communities have been abandoned, but there are still people there. People who don't have jobs, people who are trying to eke out a living. And as I was saying today at lunch, folks who've rediscovered gardens, folks who are from various parts of the world, bringing their knowledges, indigenous knowledges in many cases, of how to garden again. People who are taking what little bit they have and sharing, and who are slowly in spaces where capital has ignored them, forgotten about them. There's no Starbucks, no Best Buy, no Home Depot. They're slowly trying to figure out how to piece together life together. Because they have to. There's no cameras, no CNN, no PBS watching them, but they're doing it, right? It's those little spaces. The first step, sisters and brothers, is to do what we have been trained not to do. Pay attention to the dirt, to land. We Christians are geographically adrift. This is why most Christians I know have no doctrine of creation. We say we believe in creation, but it means absolutely nothing in the way we live. We know nothing about the places we live. We know nothing about the histories there. We don't know flows. We don't understand space at all. And the first step is to understand space. What existed in the place before your house, your school, what was there? Who lives around you? How do the traffic flows? Where are the sidewalks? Where are the not sidewalks? These basic things that of all people, Christians are some of the worst people for not knowing anything that's going on around them. Especially their churches. They think what's going on inside the church is far more important than where the church is in the first place. A church that doesn't attend to geography, whatever's going on inside of it is vapid and superficial. Just that simple.
Willie, ground that a little more in your stories about the importance of gardening. I just think that's such a critical thing in your own formation.
Yeah, I was telling a story to someone just yesterday. These memories come back to me these days. One of my mother's practices, she was a fabulous gardener learned her gardening from being in the South, being a sharecropper, picking cotton every year for someone else. So when she moved north, she had a garden, and every spring, in Michigan, when the weather turned, and when you knew when you can go into your garden, she knew when she could go into her garden because those birds returned, the ones that had left. The squirrels started acting differently because squirrels act differently when it starts to get warm. So she would always pay attention to that. I didn't know these things. She knew these things. The squirrels, and then some of those plants that grow only when they know it's time to grow. She would watch that. Then she'd come out and she'd clear her garden, take all the weeds, and then what she would do. I'm sorry, I'll be quick. I'm sorry, but
I was trying to tell you to hold the mic.
oh, sorry. So, and then what she would do is that she would, when she'd clear all the weeds and all the old stuff out, and it'd just be dirt. She would wet all the dirt. You gardeners know this. She would wet all the dirt, and it would be mud, this rich, deep, black mud. And my mother would stand out there in the middle, and she said, "Boy, come on out here. Come on out here." I was always on the side with the seed. I didn't want to go out in the mud. She said, "Come on out here. Come on out here." And she would come out and say, "Okay, now get on your knees with me. Stick your hands deep into the dirt." I said, "Oh, God, I got to do this, Mom." "Yes, stick your hands deep into the dirt." And she would have her hands deep in there, and she'd make me stick my hands deep into the dirt. And she would say, "Leave it there. You feel that? You hear that?" I didn't hear and feel nothing. Nothing. But later on, I understood what she was trying to make me hear and feel. The earth. And to feel and hear myself. Maybe the first step, sisters and brothers, is for wherever you are, wherever you live, to go find a garden, and when the season starts, get people who you don't like, go out into the garden before you start to put the seed in. It's very important. Wet it, and then maybe you and that person or people stick your hands, your arms down into the dirt together. Look at each other and ask yourselves, do you feel that? Do you hear that? See, my life, begins with people putting their hands in dirt and recognizing that this is what joins us. This is inescapable.
Do you remember the smell? You said you did not feel anything, but did you smell something?
Well, dirt has a beautiful smell. Dirt itself has a beautiful smell. Some of the other stuff that's there doesn't, but dirt has a beautiful smell. And those of you who garden, wet dirt is beautiful.
If you were to think of metaphors of social interaction, for the sticking the hands on the dirt, about 1/3 of the question had to do with that. People thinking of how does it translate to structures within the church, the institution.
Can you say more? I think I'm following you, but I just want to make sure.
The idea of what am I supposed to do at church? Seeing the church as the center and as the place where action will happen to transform and create these communities. What are the 1, 2, 3 steps to follow?
Okay. You want to take a stab at that? The 1, 2, 3 steps.
We're smelling the ground. We're smelling the dirt, but we're thinking of how.
This is always the difficult question. Where to begin? And I was trying to suggest some things a moment ago of where to begin. Here's where we are right now. We live in very segregated spaces that we don't think a lot about. And so I think one of probably the most important things a church can do is to start to ask some very basic questions about why are we here in this place as a church? Why is this church, are we here just because we got a good deal on the land? Is there some Holy Spirit reason why we're here? And what is God saying to me about where I live in relationship to where I worship? And so I want to just keep it very basic because part of the difficulty is that we run from this very first question. The first question is, we flow, we kind of go with geographic and economic flows to live wherever we can afford, whatever's possible. And we never stop to think about questions of discipleship with place. Remember in the book of Acts, here's the thing about the book of Acts, as you all know. Almost nobody in the book of Acts is doing what they want to do.
Can you tell us more?
No, almost everybody in the book of Acts is being compelled by the Spirit to go where they don't want to go. The sign of the Spirit's presence is not, oh, I'm so thankful you're here. It's like, I don't want to go there. That's the sign of the Spirit's presence. Think about it. In fact, I don't know if there's anybody who says, yes, I'll go. I want to go do what you want, Spirit. They're all like, can you get somebody else? Of course, my favorite is Ananias, who has to go to Saul. And, the Spirit says you have to go. And then he says, rumor has it, did you tell God the rumors that this man's a killer? I don't know if God knows that, but I don't think God would have sent me to a killer. Yeah.
Do you think God will be sending us today to other souls that have been transformed into Pauls?
I think the reality of the Holy Spirit's presence, especially in this church in the country, is that the fundamental reality is that we are resisting the Spirit. And I think the fundamental reality is that we have especially resisted the Spirit in thinking about place where we live in geography. We have had no serious thinking in terms of discipleship in relationship to real estate, in relationship to developers, in relationship to land. We've had no serious discipleship in thinking about those things. We have allowed the entire world to be a part of economic calculation and not gospel calculation. That's the bottom line for us. We resist the Spirit saying, stop being quiet when it comes to how communities are formed, how neighborhoods are formed, how, when I go places and lecture, I always say the most important ethical meeting that happens in any community is when the city commissioners meet once or twice a month and they sit there and there's nobody out there in the audience and they're deciding on price points for homes, they're deciding on where streets will, where bus routes will run. These are deep moral issues and we are not there. And so I would much prefer to talk about Christians going to those meetings than talking about what we're doing in the church. Because if we're not at those meetings, I really don't care what you're doing in the church because you're not making any difference. If you are not talking about where buses run, where sidewalks are and where they're not, I don't care what you talk about in the church because you're not making any difference to people who can only ride buses. You're not in the room. But you want to bring them into your church, but you're not in the room. I'm sorry, I'm fussing now. Forgive me. Fussing.
We are feeling it. Give us the 30 seconds of wisdom on that more. Are you thinking of cooperatives, financial movement?
Yes. I want to begin with knowledge. So I'm repeating myself now, but I want to begin with knowledge. I want everyone here in this room to find out when your city commissioners meet to discuss bus routes, housing, price points, real estate, and I want every Christian here to go to those meetings. And I want you to learn how your cities function, how your towns function. And I want you to push against the segregation that is built inside economic segregation. I want you to fight and argue about where people are allowed to live, where people can't live, about housing, about fair housing. I want you to be there pushing as hard as you possibly can, because when you do that, you'll start to address whiteness.
Dr. Labberton, would you like to have some final words?
I think the thing I want to say is that when I think about the people that are here tonight and the fact that they live all over the world, many of them live in contexts completely outside the U.S., as well as those of us that live inside the U.S. And the sense of place varies so much, right? Even today, the places that have been spoken about by the people that have spoken from the platform are people that occupy different spaces. And I guess just speak a little bit more about how does a person come into space and weigh it in the way that you're describing? What's happening?
Everywhere that private property has become a new reality, everywhere where people are being taught to look out at their world through calculation and commodification, they're losing their world. So whether it's here or someplace else, or other parts of the world, if you are inside those calculations, and if they are being mapped on top of, old forms of segregation, as the dear brother talked about this morning, the caste system, if they're inside old forms, the question of discipleship, I think, is not simply how you should live, but where you should live and how you should rethink your life in a place. That's what I would want people to do, to really start to think about the placement of discipleship. If the incarnation teaches us anything, is that God cares about place. It's not inconsequential. And unfortunately, I think for so many people, it has become inconsequential for us. Which again, I think means I'm not sure the world really matters to us.